Part 1. A Body Without a Country. Boston, Empire, and Unfree Lives, 1723 to 1765. Boston in the middle decades of the 18th century presents itself in ledgers and sermons as a city of order. The ink is confident. Names are entered, goods counted, ships logged, duties paid. On paper, the town is a disciplined organism within the British Empire, obedient to law, structured by trade, protected by crown and charter. Yet beneath this surface, another Boston persists, less legible and more crowded, where bodies move without names and labor circulates without acknowledgement. The port is the city's heart. Every tide brings barrels of sugar and molasses, timber and fish, rum and enslaved people, even when the word itself is avoided. Slavery exists here not as an anomaly, but as a fact folded into daily life. It does not always appear in bold declarations. It appears instead in wills, in household inventories, in baptismal records where a first name is written and a last name is absent. It appears in the margins, where ownership is assumed rather than argued. Massachusetts prefers to describe itself as different from the plantation colonies to the south. There are no vast fields of tobacco here, no gangs visible at a distance. Enslavement is domestic, maritime, intimate. A man cooks in a merchant's kitchen. A woman launders clothes behind a meeting house. A boy carries goods from dock to warehouse. Their labor oils the machinery of commerce, while their presence remains officially peripheral. The law accommodates this contradiction by speaking carefully. It regulates slaves without defining slavery. It protects property without naming people. Boston's streets at night tell a truer story. Narrow, uneven, lit poorly. They echo with footsteps that do not belong to the men whose names appear in town records. Sailors sleep wherever work has left them. Enslaved laborers move between errands after dark because daylight belongs to their owners. Free black people, few and vulnerable, carry proof of status in their pockets, knowing it may not suffice. Silence becomes a survival skill, so does speed. The empire insists on hierarchy. The crown insists on obedience. The city insists on respectability. But all three depend on bodies that can be compelled. Violence is present, though rarely recorded in detail. Bruises are not archived. Fear does not sign its name. What remains are traces, a fine imposed, a punishment authorized, a sale executed. The system functions because its victims are replaceable on paper. Into this world, sometime around the early 1720s, a child is born who will later be called Crispus Attucks. The circumstances are uncertain. The archives hesitate. His ancestry is described in fragments, African, indigenous, words that mark him as doubly unprotected. In this place and time, such lineage does not merely describe origin, it defines legal exposure. A body so marked belongs by default to someone else. Childhood for the enslaved in Massachusetts is rarely described, but its outline is familiar. Work begins early. Discipline is physical and immediate. Education, if it occurs at all, is accidental. The law does not require cruelty. It permits it. Masters are cautioned against excess, not because the enslaved are valued as people, but because damaged property is less productive. Morality is present, but it is measured in losses. Boston's churches preach salvation. They baptize enslaved children while reassuring owners that conversion does not interfere with ownership. Spiritual equality is promised in the afterlife. Inequality is enforced in the present. The contradiction is not resolved. It is rehearsed weekly. Congregations learn to accept both statements as true. By mid-century, imperial tension begins to thicken the air. Wars overseas demand ships, supplies, sailors. The port grows busier, louder, more volatile. Labor becomes more mobile, so does opportunity. For the enslaved, the sea represents both danger and possibility. Ships require hands. Names are often improvised. Absence can be explained as delay. A man who knows how to work rigging can sometimes choose his direction, if only briefly. Runaway notices multiply in the newspapers. They describe bodies with forensic precision, height, scars, complexion, clothing. They are written to retrieve property, but they inadvertently record individuality, a limp, a way of speaking, a suspected talent for the sea. These descriptions betray anxiety. Owners know that movement threatens control. The city's density makes escape imaginable, if not sustainable. Sometime around 1750, Crispus Attucks is no longer where the law expects him to be. He leaves behind an owner, a location, a legal identity defined by possession. The notice that seeks him reduces him to attributes and value, but it also confirms something else. that he has acted. Flight is not a philosophical position. It is a calculation made under pressure. It accepts uncertainty in exchange for agency. From that moment, Attucks exists in a liminal state, not legally free, not fully captive. He moves through docks and taverns, aboard vessels where documentation is flexible and loyalty temporary. Each day requires judgment. Each encounter carries risk. To be recognized is to be returned. To be unseen is to survive. This is not freedom, but it is distance from the plantation logic of ownership. Boston, meanwhile, continues to imagine itself as a city of rights. Its merchants argue against taxation. Its pamphleteers invoke ancient liberties. The language of freedom circulates widely, even as it excludes. Enslaved and formerly enslaved people hear these words as well. They measure them against experience. They notice who is addressed and who is not. The empire tightens its grip. Soldiers arrive. Barracks fill. Red coats appear in streets already crowded with men struggling to earn wages. Authority becomes visible, audible, insistent. The city begins to resent being watched. Those who have always been watched understand the feeling differently. Surveillance is not new to them. Power is. By 1765, Boston is restless. Paper accumulates. Acts, protests, petitions. Ink is spent generously on arguments about representation and rights. Less ink is spent on the unfree lives that continue to underpin the city's economy. Crispus Attucks, now a man shaped by work and evasion, stands outside the official story. He is present but uncounted. His body carries the marks of labor and vigilance, not of citizenship. This is the condition in which the narrative opens. A city preparing to declare principles it does not yet intend to apply universally. An empire asserting order through force. And a man without legal standing moving through both systems. His name appears only when he disrupts expectations. His life is unremarkable to the archive until it becomes inconvenient. The file remains thin, the silence is deliberate, and the night, in Boston, grows heavier. Part 2. Property on paper. Slavery, runaways, and the law of Massachusetts. The law in Massachusetts does not shout its intentions. It speaks quietly, in clauses and omissions, in habits repeated often enough to become invisible. There is no single founding statute that declares slavery into existence. Instead, there is a network of permissions, customs inherited, precedents unchallenged, transactions normalized. Human bondage survives not because it is loudly defended, but because it is efficiently managed. In courtrooms and council chambers, the word slave appears rarely, yet the condition it describes is everywhere. Bills of sale transfer people alongside livestock and furniture. Wills distribute them as part of an estate, valued, assessed, and assigned. The law recognizes these acts without interrogating their meaning. Ownership is presumed legitimate so long as it is documented properly. Paper confers authority. Absence of paper confers vulnerability. Massachusetts presents itself as a colony governed by reason and contract. Its legal culture prizes written proof, signatures, sworn statements. This devotion to documentation becomes a weapon against those least able to produce it. Enslaved people are expected to obey laws they did not consent to and to prove freedoms they were never granted. The burden of evidence rests permanently on the body marked as suspect. Runaway advertisements reveal this logic with particular clarity. They are legal instruments disguised as public notices. Each one authorizes pursuit, capture, and return. The language is precise, almost clinical. Height, complexion, scars, manner of dress, way of speaking. These descriptions reduce a person to recoverable features, transforming individuality into a tracking device. The reward offered assigns a monetary value to disappearance, turning flight into theft. The law does not ask why someone runs, it asks only from whom. Motivation is irrelevant. Fear, violence, exhaustion, none of these appear in the text. Escape is framed as breach of property rights, not as resistance to coercion. The system is structured so that movement itself becomes evidence of guilt. For men like Crispus Attucks, this legal environment creates a permanent state of exposure. To move is to risk recognition. To stay is to invite capture. The city offers concealment but not protection. Massachusetts law allows any white citizen to detain a suspected runaway. Suspicion requires no warrant. Skin color, accent, silence, these are sufficient. Freedom in this context is not a status, it is a performance. One must appear entitled to move, to speak, to work. Papers, if possessed, must be produced quickly and convincingly. A moment of hesitation can undo years of careful survival. The law grants wide discretion to those who enforce it and almost none to those subjected to it. The courts reinforce this imbalance. Enslaved people cannot testify against whites in many proceedings. Their accounts of abuse carry little weight. Owners, by contrast, are presumed credible by default. The system does not require constant violence because it has already arranged belief. Authority speaks once and is echoed everywhere. Contracts for indentured servitude complicate the picture but do not soften it. They create the appearance of mutual obligation while preserving coercion. Time replaces ownership, but control remains absolute during its duration. For people of color, the distinction between indenture and slavery is often theoretical. Enforcement looks the same. Punishment feels the same. Massachusetts legislators occasionally debate the moral implications of bondage. The discussions are cautious, abstract, delayed. Economic necessity is cited. Social stability is invoked. Reform is postponed to an unspecified future. Meanwhile, the existing order continues uninterrupted. The law's greatest skill is its ability to defer responsibility without relinquishing power. Within this framework, a runaway like Attucks occupies a dangerous ambiguity. He is no longer under direct supervision, yet the law continues to claim him. His body is legally legible as property even in the absence of an owner. Anyone who encounters him can, in theory, activate the machinery of return. Every interaction carries the threat of reclassification, from laborer to fugitive, from man to asset. The sea offers partial insulation from this scrutiny. Aboard a ship, authority shifts. Crews are assembled quickly. Names are taken loosely. Work speaks louder than paperwork. But this freedom is conditional and fragile. Ports require clearance. Wages are paid through intermediaries. Dockside authorities remain alert for bodies that do not belong. Massachusetts law treats black and indigenous bodies as inherently mobile risks. Their movement must be explained, justified, authorized. Stillness is safer, but it is rarely sustainable. Labor demands motion. Survival requires adaptability. The law does not accommodate these realities. It punishes them. The contradiction deepens as revolutionary rhetoric begins to circulate. Pamphlets denounce tyranny. Speeches invoke natural rights. The language is expansive, philosophical, confident. Yet the legal treatment of runaways remains unchanged. Freedom is discussed as an abstract principle while denied as a practical condition. The gap between words and enforcement widens. For those already unfree, this rhetoric is not liberating, it is disorienting. The promise of liberty rings hollow when the law continues to define escape as crime. Attucks lives inside this dissonance. He hears the city argue about rights while reserving none for him. The law's selective vision becomes impossible to ignore. Property law proves remarkably flexible when human beings are involved. It adapts to moral pressure without collapsing. It absorbs criticism by shifting language, not outcomes. The enslaved remain accountable to statutes written without their participation. Runaways remain recoverable objects. Justice remains procedural, not experiential. The archive preserves this imbalance faithfully. Court records are meticulous, notices are plentiful. What is missing are the voices of those acted upon. Their fears, calculations, and losses do not survive in ink. The law does not require them. Silence becomes part of the structure. Crispus Attucks continues to move through this legal landscape without protection. His life is shaped less by dramatic confrontations than by constant assessment. Which street? Which dock? Which hour? He learns the rhythms of enforcement, the blind spots of authority. This knowledge keeps him alive, but it also isolates him. Every decision must be made alone. Massachusetts law will later present itself as progressive, even enlightened. It will claim an early distance from slavery, but in these years, the distance is rhetorical. On the ground, ownership persists. Control persists. The law's indifference persists. This is the environment that hardens Attucks, not into a symbol, not into a hero, but into a man accustomed to navigating systems designed to deny him standing. His body remains under claim. His name remains searchable. His freedom, such as it is, exists only in motion. The file remains open. The paper accumulates. And the law waits patiently for the moment when ambiguity can be resolved by force. Part 3. Crispus Attucks, between records and absence. Crispus Attucks enters the historical record indirectly, through other people's needs. His name does not appear in a birth register with ceremony or clarity. It surfaces instead in fragments, attached to descriptions, to property claims, to moments of inconvenience. The archive does not preserve him as a subject, it preserves him as a problem. What is known is partial and unstable. He is described as a man of African and indigenous descent, tall, physically imposing, accustomed to labor. His age is estimated rather than recorded. His place of birth is inferred rather than confirmed. Even his name is not entirely secure, spelled and respelled, depending on the hand that writes it. The documents agree on only one thing, that he belonged to someone, and then he did not. The most substantial trace of his early life is a notice of flight. In that text, his body is broken down into measurable features. His height is approximated, his complexion is categorized, his clothing is listed not as expression but as evidence. The notice is designed to make him visible to strangers, to transform the city into an extension of the owner's surveillance. It assumes that recognition will lead to capture, that civic cooperation will complete the transaction. What the notice cannot capture is the moment before departure. The calculation that precedes escape does not appear on the page. There is no record of violence endured, no inventory of threats made or promises broken. The archive does not concern itself with motive, it concerns itself with recovery. The absence of explanation is treated as neutrality, but it is a choice. After this moment, Attucks vanishes again. He is no longer catalogued because he is no longer contained. For years, he exists in a space the law struggles to document, neither properly enslaved nor securely free. He does not leave behind contracts or petitions. He does not sign his name. He works, and work leaves fewer traces than ownership. To survive in Boston without legal protection requires discipline. It requires attention to appearance, speech, timing. A man of color must learn how to be forgettable without being suspicious. He must blend into crowds that do not see him as equal and yet remain alert to sudden interest. Every interaction is a negotiation conducted under asymmetrical risk. The docks offer possibility but not safety. Sailors move constantly, but they are also scrutinized. Crews are desperate for labor and quick to discard it. A man can find work one day and be questioned the next. Attucks likely learns to navigate this instability, taking advantage of moments when authority is distracted or divided. He becomes fluent in impermanence. The archive does not follow him during these years. It does not track his wages or friendships. It does not record where he sleeps or whom he trusts. This silence is often mistaken for insignificance. In reality, it reflects a structural bias. The lives of the unfree are not considered worthy of continuous observation unless they disrupt ownership. What can be reconstructed instead is the environment that shapes him. Boston in the 1760s is crowded, tense, unevenly policed. British soldiers occupy public spaces. Competition for work intensifies. Sailors, dock workers, apprentices, and laborers share taverns and grievances. Violence is common but rarely prosecuted with consistency. Authority is visible but unreliable. For a man like Attucks, physical presence is both asset and liability. Strength secures employment but also invites attention. Size can deter some threats while amplifying others. He cannot afford to be careless. He cannot afford to be conspicuous. The archive later describes him as a leader, but leadership in this context is informal and situational. It is born of proximity and urgency, not title. His racial identity further complicates his position. As a man of African and indigenous descent, he exists outside the colonial categories that govern sympathy. He is not imagined as a future citizen. He is not included in the rhetorical debates about representation and rights. When he appears in public discourse, it is as an object of concern rather than a participant. Yet he is not isolated. He moves among others who live at the margins of legality. Free black sailors, enslaved men hired out by owners, indigenous laborers displaced from their lands. These communities are fluid, overlapping, and vulnerable. They share information quietly. They learn which authorities are lenient, which are dangerous, which can be avoided altogether. The law does not recognize these networks, but it is unsettled by them. Mobility undermines control. Informal solidarity complicates enforcement. Each unrecorded day is a small failure of the system. Attucks's continued existence outside of ownership is, in itself, a disruption. As tensions between the colonies and the crown escalate, public discourse grows louder. Newspapers fill with arguments about liberty, corruption, and abuse of power. The language is expansive and moralistic. It invokes history, philosophy, and scripture. It does not address the contradictions unfolding on the streets beneath it. Attucks hears these arguments not as theory, but as atmosphere. They circulate in taverns and along wharves. They mix with complaints about wages, impressment, and military presence. The distinction between political grievance and personal survival blurs. Authority becomes a shared adversary, though experienced differently by different bodies. Still, Attucks remains absent from the official narrative. He does not author pamphlets. He does not attend town meetings. His relationship to power is not articulated through speech but through movement. He is shaped by constraint rather than representation. The archive continues to overlook him because it is not designed to register endurance. This absence will later become paradoxical. When Attucks dies, his name will suddenly matter, his body will be examined, described, argued over. His actions will be assigned meaning retroactively. But in life, he remains largely undocumented, his presence tolerated only insofar as it does not challenge ownership directly. The silence surrounding his daily existence is not accidental. It reflects a broader pattern in which the unfree are rendered legible only at moments of crisis. Normalcy, for them, is not preserved. Only disruption earns attention. This logic will shape how Attucks is remembered and misremembered. For now, he lives between categories, between slavery and freedom, between visibility and erasure, between the law's reach and its neglect. He carries no guarantee of protection, only the knowledge acquired through survival. His life is not yet a symbol. It is simply a series of days navigated carefully under a system that refuses to acknowledge his humanity. The archive remains thin, the gaps remain wide, and history waits for the moment when absence will be replaced by spectacle. Part 4. The Port at Night. Sailors, Soldiers, and Accumulated Rage. By the late 1760s, Boston is no longer merely a port. It is a pressure chamber. The city's geography concentrates conflict. Narrow streets that funnel crowds, waterfront alleys that trap sound, taverns pressed against warehouses, homes built close enough to hear arguments through walls. At night, the town seems to hold its breath, waiting for the next spark. In daylight, it pretends to be governed by paper. The Empire's presence is now physical. British soldiers move through Boston not as visitors but as a permanent feature, posted, quartered, ordered to patrol. They stand in doorways and on corners, wearing the authority of the crown like armor. Their muskets are visible. Their discipline is rehearsed. Yet they are also young men far from home, underpaid and resented, competing with locals for work and dignity. The uniform makes them instruments of policy. The body inside the uniform carries hunger and anger. For working men on the waterfront, this changes everything. Sailors, rope makers, dockhands, and apprentices live close to the edge even in stable times. They survive on wages that vanish between voyages. They are often indebted, often drunk, often injured. Their labor is seasonal and exploitable. Now, soldiers enter their labor market as rivals, taking casual work on the side when their military pay fails them. What might have remained private hardship becomes public friction. The conflict is not abstract. It takes the form of a man turned away from a job because another man will do it cheaper. It takes the form of insults exchanged in a doorway, fists raised in a crowd, threats made with the confidence that the law will favor one side. The city's class tensions tighten into a constant background hum, resentment without resolution. Boston's elite speaks in a different register. Merchants and lawyers argue about taxation, representation, imperial overreach. Their concerns are not imaginary, but their language is controlled and strategic. They produce petitions and pamphlets, carefully reasoned. They depict the colony as a victim of unjust authority. Yet, for the unfree and the precarious, authority has never required justification. It has always been immediate. This is the crucial fracture. Boston begins to talk about liberty at the same time it becomes more militarized, more surveilled, more inclined toward coercion. The rhetoric rises, the streets harden. The law remains what it has always been, an instrument of property and order, but now it is backed by redcoats and bayonets. At night, the port reveals what the daytime record tries to smooth over. Dockside taverns fill with men whose bodies are worn down by rope, salt, and cold. Conversation is sharp, restless. The air is thick with rumor. New taxes, new troops, new crackdowns. Sailors speak of impressment, being seized and forced into service at sea, an imperial practice that turns free men into unwilling labor. They speak of violence as if it is weather, expected, uncontrollable, sometimes fatal. Crispus Attucks moves through this environment as both participant and observer. He is a working man among working men, but his vulnerability is deeper. A sailor can be impressed. Attucks can be captured as well, returned to ownership on suspicion alone. The pressure he carries is not only economic, it is existential. He must always calculate how quickly a crowd can become dangerous, how fast a confrontation can turn into a legal trap. Yet the port also offers him cover. Crowds are noisy and shifting, people come and go. Names are less important than labor. A man who can haul, lift, steer, and endure is useful. Utility provides temporary invisibility. The same anonymity that enables exploitation also enables survival. Boston's working class is not unified, but it shares a sense of being used. Sailors resent merchants who profit from their risk. Laborers resent officials who speak of law while allowing brutality. Apprentices resent masters who preach discipline while hoarding wealth. Into this resentment, soldiers are inserted like a wedge. They are both agents of imperial power and another group of exploited bodies. This ambiguity makes every encounter unstable. Fights break out regularly. Sometimes they are planned, sometimes spontaneous. A soldier insults a sailor throws a punch, a crowd gathers, hungry for an outcome. These incidents leave traces in complaints, in rumors, in occasional arrests, but most are never officially recorded. The archive tends to notice violence only when it threatens order visibly enough to demand response. The rope makers' conflicts, in particular, become emblematic of the new atmosphere. Rope is essential to maritime life, and the men who make it are skilled, proud, and easily provoked by interference. When soldiers seek work in the rope walks, it is not a small matter. It is a direct intrusion into the worker's domain, and it is treated as such. Confrontations there are not just brawls, they are rehearsals for something larger, groups forming, tempers escalating, authority losing control. In the streets, boys follow soldiers and taunt them. Men shout, snow and mud soak boots. The city's physical discomfort becomes emotional fuel. Winter makes tempers sharper, darkness gives cover, and every person knows that British muskets are not decorative. The official version of these tensions insists on order and restraint. Authorities describe the soldiers as necessary for peace, stationed to prevent riot and protect property. They depict the locals as unruly, easily manipulated by agitators. Boston's patriot leaders, for their part, describe the soldiers as oppressors and the townspeople as defenders of liberty. Both narratives use the language of control. Both are willing to treat working bodies as instruments. The reality experienced by those bodies is less coherent and more frightening. A sailor walking home drunk is not thinking of constitutional theory when he sees a sentry. He is thinking of humiliation, of being struck, of being arrested, of being made an example. A black laborer hears the same boots on cobblestones and understands that protection is not meant for him. The law's promises do not extend to his skin. In this climate, rumor becomes a form of currency. Each night produces new stories. Soldiers planning revenge, locals planning resistance, officials preparing arrests. The lack of reliable information keeps everyone on edge. Fear is not only of violence, but of what violence will authorize afterward. New crackdowns, new patrols, new justifications for force. Attucks, like many men of the waterfront, learns to read the city's signals. A sudden quiet in a tavern, a cluster of men outside a doorway, a soldier stepping forward too quickly. He has survived long enough to understand escalation. He has also survived long enough to know that avoidance is not always possible. A system built on coercion will eventually demand submission from those who refuse it. By early 1770, Boston feels like a place where something inevitable is approaching. The details remain uncertain, but the trajectory is clear. Crowds are quicker to gather, insults are quicker to become violence. The presence of troops means that any confrontation carries the possibility of gunfire. The port at night holds all of this: class grievance, imperial authority, racial vulnerability, and accumulated rage in the same cold air. It is not a single cause. It is a convergence. The law waits behind it all, ready to interpret events afterward in ways that preserve power. Crispus Attucks remains a man without protection, moving among men who believe they are defending rights they have not fully defined. The city's slogans about liberty echo through streets where bondage still functions quietly. And in the darkness, the distance between rhetoric and reality narrows. The file grows thicker now. The paper begins to anticipate violence. And Boston, exhausted and watchful, moves toward March 5th as though pulled by a tide it can no longer resist. Part 5. March 5th, 1770. Snow, clubs, muskets. March 5th begins like many winter days in Boston. Cold air, dirty snow pressed into the street by boots and wheels, twilight arriving early. The city is tense before any single event gives it a name. Soldiers are posted at familiar points. Townspeople move through narrow lanes with the practiced impatience of those who feel watched. The port is restless, the taverns loud, the day already burdened by the memory of previous fights. The official version will later describe what happens as a sudden disturbance, an unruly crowd, a threatened sentry, frightened soldiers reacting under pressure. It will emphasize provocation, confusion, self-defense. It will insist that the law was challenged and the law responded. The reality experienced in the streets is less tidy. It is a sequence of moments where anger becomes momentum, where people gather because gathering is what they have been practicing for months. The crowd that forms is not a formal assembly. It is a street organism, boys, laborers, sailors, apprentices, drawn by noise and confrontation. They do not arrive with a unified plan. They arrive with accumulated grievance. In the early evening, a dispute near a loyalist's shop becomes one more spark. There are insults, accusations, shoving. News travels quickly in a small city. Men who have spent days hearing complaints step into the street at night ready to witness something, to participate in something, to feel power for a moment. Snowballs are easy weapons, so are sticks, so are words. Outside the custom house, a British sentry stands in the cold, posted beside a building that represents the Empire's authority in brick and glass. Customs duties, seizures, enforcement. This is where imperial policy touches local life. In the distance, the harbor's masts and rigging cut into the night like black lines against the sky. The crowd's attention fixes on the sentry because he is visible, because he is alone, because he embodies a system that does not listen. Voices rise. The sentry calls for support. Footsteps approach, other soldiers responding, muskets in hand. Their presence changes the mathematics of the street. The crowd is larger, but the soldiers carry firearms. No one can pretend now that the confrontation is merely symbolic. The cold intensifies the sense of distance between bodies. Everyone's breath is visible, each word made physical in the air. Crispus Attucks is there. The archive will later identify him among the crowd, describing him as a sailor or dock worker, tall, strong, conspicuous. His precise actions in the first moments are contested, and this contest will become central to everything that follows. The law will need him to be an instigator. Patriot memory will need him to be a victim. Neither version can fully accommodate the complexity of a man who has lived under coercion all his life. In the street before the shots, categories blur. Men shout at the soldiers. Some throw snow, ice, debris. Some brandish sticks. Some stand back but do not leave. The crowd is not a single mind. It is a shifting field of courage and fear. The soldiers are not a single mind either. They are trained to hold formation, but training is not certainty. They are young, cold, surrounded, and hated. The moments compress. Someone strikes or threatens to strike. Someone dares the soldiers to fire. Someone cries that they will not. Someone says they will. Authority and defiance circle each other like animals in a small cage. The official record will later try to reconstruct exactly who said what, who moved first, who raised a weapon. Witnesses will disagree. Some will be confident. Others will be uncertain. The archive will preserve their contradictions as though contradiction itself were the truth. But the lived reality is that the street is loud, and fear distorts perception. Night compresses distance. Snow reflects light unevenly. A single shove can become a riot in memory. Crispus Attucks is close to the soldiers. The reasons for that closeness are disputed. In one account, he advances aggressively, leading others with a club. In another, he stands as part of the crowd's front edge, pushed forward by momentum he did not control. In another, he attempts to intervene, to strike, to block, to shout. The archive will treat his body as evidence, but it cannot fully explain intent. What matters in the immediate moment is proximity. The line between crowd and soldiers has narrowed to the space of a few feet. Muskets are raised. The crowd does not disperse. If there is a moment when retreat is still possible, it passes quickly, unnoticed. The confrontation has reached the point where pride and fear lock together. Then the shots. Gunfire in a confined street is different from gunfire in open space. It is sharper, louder, amplified by walls. It transforms argument into irreversible fact. The first discharge is remembered as confusion. Some witnesses later claim it was accidental, a musket fired without order. Others claim a command was given. In the archive, this question becomes everything, because command determines guilt. In the street, the difference lasts only an instant. The first shot produces the second produces the third. The line breaks into noise and smoke. Bodies fall. Crispus Attucks is struck. He collapses onto the snow that has already been darkened by city grime. In the official narrative later constructed by the defense, his fall is an unfortunate consequence of his aggression. In the reality of the moment, it is simply a man's body losing its capacity to stand. The cold does not pause. The crowd does not pause. For a few seconds, the street is only shock. Then comes movement. Some in the crowd flee. Some rush toward the fallen. Some shout. Soldiers recoil or reform. The musket smoke lingers in the air, drifting like a fog that refuses to dissipate. The custom house remains standing, indifferent, as though the building itself were trained not to react. More men lie wounded or dead. Their names will later be recorded carefully because death forces documentation. The living can remain vague. The dead must be counted. In that grim arithmetic, Crispus Attucks becomes visible in a way he has not been before. The archive will preserve his death more clearly than it preserved his life. Authorities move quickly to contain the narrative. Soldiers are taken into custody not necessarily as punishment but as procedure, an early signal that the law intends to absorb this violence and process it. Leaders urge calm. Crowds gather again, now with a different purpose. Grief, outrage, pressure. The city understands that what has happened cannot be undone. It can only be interpreted. That night, Boston becomes a place where competing versions begin immediately. The official version emphasizes the crowd's disorder and the soldiers' fear. The townspeople's version emphasizes imperial brutality and unprovoked murder. In taverns and homes, people repeat what they saw, or what they believe they saw, until belief hardens into certainty. Crispus Attucks's body lies at the center of this contested space. He is no longer merely a man navigating the margins of law. He is now a dead man whose meaning will be negotiated by those who outlive him. His mixed ancestry, his status as a runaway, his occupation on the waterfront, each detail will be used as a tool. The archive will become a battleground of character as much as fact. But in the immediate reality of March 5th, there is only the street in winter, the sound of muskets, the sudden weight of silence after gunfire, and the certainty that a system built on force has shown its face openly. The file is no longer thin. It is stained by event. And Boston, which has been speaking of liberty in abstract terms, now confronts liberty's cost in bodies, some honored, some convenient, and some, like Attucks, claimed by history only when they are beyond the reach of law's daily violence. Part 6. The dead are named. Autopsies, rumors, and engravings. When the shooting stops, the city does what it always does after violence. It begins to arrange bodies into meaning. The street is cleared. The wounded are carried away. The soldiers are moved under guard. The crowd disperses, then returns in smaller knots, hungry for explanation. In the cold air, shock turns quickly into narrative. Boston has learned that whoever controls the first story can shape the rest. The official machinery responds with speed that is not necessarily compassion. There are procedures, inventories, lists. Death forces documentation. A man who could live years without leaving a trace in the record now becomes legible because he has ceased to move. Names are collected with a gravity the living rarely receive. Accounts are taken. Witnesses are approached. The law begins immediately to prepare its own defense, a framework in which authority is never the first aggressor. For Crispus Attucks, this is a cruel transition. The archive that could not hold his life now claims his death. His body becomes a site of interpretation. It will be spoken about by men who did not know him, measured by hands that never shook his, discussed in rooms where he would not have been allowed to sit. His presence is suddenly unavoidable, and yet his humanity remains negotiable. The dead are brought indoors. In a city of wood and brick, rooms are not designed for public mourning. They are adapted for it. The bodies are examined. Wounds are described. Angles and entry points are noted with the cold precision of legal necessity. These observations are not conducted to understand suffering. They are conducted to establish liability. The line between medicine and law is thin here, and it bends toward the courtroom. Outside, rumor expands faster than any official report can contain. Some say the soldiers fired without command. Some say the crowd threatened to kill them. Some say there were clubs raised, that the sentry was struck, that the soldiers panicked. Each version serves a different moral conclusion. In Boston, rumor is not merely gossip. It is political material. This is how violence becomes public property. The dead are mourned, but they are also used. Their bodies become arguments in a larger struggle over legitimacy. If the soldiers fired unlawfully, the empire is exposed as tyrannical. If the crowd provoked the shooting, the town is exposed as lawless. Both sides will insist that the dead prove their point. Crispus Attucks is immediately complicated evidence. His identity does not fit cleanly into Boston's preferred self-portrait. He is not a respectable merchant. He is not a celebrated lawyer. He is not a child. He is a working man of African and indigenous descent associated with the waterfront, a space the elite often treats as necessary but morally suspect. In death, he becomes both a martyr and an inconvenience. The city's leaders understand this tension instinctively. They want unity against imperial violence, but they also want control over the symbolism of that unity. The names of the dead will be spoken publicly. The funerals will be arranged with deliberation. Mourning will become a display, solemn, collective, disciplined, meant to prove that Boston is capable of order even in grief. The funeral procession, when it comes, is staged in the language of civic virtue. Thousands are said to attend. The streets fill not with riot but with silence, a silence as performative as it is sincere. The city displays its pain as evidence of its restraint. It offers the dead as proof that it was wronged, and it offers its mourning as proof that it remains civilized. In the official imagination, this matters. A crowd that can march quietly can also claim moral superiority. A town that buries its dead with dignity can argue that it deserves dignity in return. The dead bodies become a kind of petition, written not in ink but in weight and absence. Yet beneath the procession's surface, reality persists. The dead men, including Attucks, are not equal even in death. Their families, their social standing, their racial identities shape how they are remembered and by whom. Some names will be repeated in respectable homes, others will be spoken most loudly in taverns and on wharves. Attucks's name will circulate unevenly, celebrated by those who see his death as proof of shared vulnerability, and quietly avoided by those who fear that his prominence unsettles the story they want to tell. In the weeks that follow, paper begins to crystallize the event. Newspapers publish accounts, some cautious, some inflammatory. Pamphlets appear, depictions are made, and then an image arrives that will harden perception. An engraving showing a line of British soldiers firing into a group of townspeople. It is not a photograph. It is not neutral. It is a constructed scene meant to teach the viewer how to feel. The soldiers stand in clean formation, faces blank, firing as though on command. The townspeople are arranged as victims. The setting is simplified. The chaos of the night is replaced with clarity. The image offers what the street could not, a moral diagram. In this diagram, the dead are useful. Their bodies confirm the narrative of innocence betrayed by power. The engraving does not capture the confusion, the shouts, the snowballs, the panic. It captures the conclusion Boston wants, that authority fired deliberately into the people. This is where the archive becomes dangerous. It does not only preserve, it persuades. Ink and etching turn an event into a symbol, and symbols are resistant to later nuance. The engraving travels beyond Boston. It enters other colonies. It becomes evidence for people who were not there. It turns local death into continental grievance. Crispus Attucks appears within this symbolic space, but remains unsettled. Depending on the depiction, his body is present among the fallen, but his identity is not always emphasized. The image does not say runaway, it does not say enslaved, it does not say indigenous. It shows a body as part of the people. That inclusion is potent, but it is also selective. It includes him only by stripping away the particular conditions that made his life precarious. The official version of events continues to form in parallel. Authorities compile witness statements. They gather depositions. They evaluate the dead as part of a legal calculation. Were the soldiers justified? Were they threatened? Who initiated violence? Here, Attucks is not simply a victim. He becomes a potential catalyst. His size, his race, his occupation, all are details that can be leveraged to frame the crowd as dangerous. This is the moment when the dead begin to be divided into innocent and provocative, a division that will haunt the trial. In moral terms, the city wants all 5 dead men to stand as one. In legal terms, the defense will benefit from separating them, especially separating Attucks from the rest. The psychological tension tightens. Boston needs a martyr, but it fears what kind of martyr Attucks represents. A runaway enslaved man becoming the first to die for colonial liberty exposes the hypocrisy at the heart of the rhetoric. If liberty is sacred, why was his liberty criminal? If tyranny is intolerable, why was his bondage tolerated? These questions are rarely asked directly. Instead, they linger in the choices made about language and emphasis. In some retellings, Attucks is foregrounded as evidence that the Empire kills indiscriminately. In others, he is backgrounded to keep the narrative clean. The city's grief is real, but it is managed. Meanwhile, ordinary Bostonians remember the night as they experienced it, as fear, as sudden gunfire, as bodies falling on snow. Their memory is raw and inconsistent, and it competes with the growing authority of printed accounts. Over time, what people saw will matter less than what they can cite. The case file begins to dominate the event itself. In this transition from street to paper, Crispus Attucks becomes both present and absent. Present as a body, a name, a death. Absent as a full life, a voice, a history. The archive will now build him into something larger than himself, while continuing to deny him the basic dignity of being fully known. The city moves forward into procedure. The dead are buried. The rumors continue. The engraving circulates. And the courtroom waits, ready to turn grief into testimony, and testimony into a verdict that will decide not only what happened, but what Boston is allowed to claim happened. Part 7. The Trial, Testimony, Silence, and Legal Strategy. By late March 1770, the street has been converted into a file. The violence of March 5th is no longer measured in breath and gun smoke but in depositions, sworn statements, and carefully copied names. Boston's leaders insist that the soldiers must be tried, not lynched, that the town must prove it is governed by law even when law has failed it. The official version takes shape inside that promise. A lawful process will restore order, and order will become a kind of moral victory. Yet the courtroom is not neutral ground. It is an instrument. It has rules about who may speak, what counts as truth, and which bodies are presumed credible. The dead cannot testify. The living are filtered through procedure, and procedure, in an empire built on hierarchy, is rarely innocent. In September 1770 in Boston, Captain Thomas Preston is tried first. The setting is formal, deliberate, crowded. Paper is everywhere. Indictments, juror lists, docket entries, notes taken in the margins. Outside the courthouse, the city remembers blood on snow. Inside, the law demands calm sentences, chronological narratives, and certainty where there was none. Preston's defense argues a simple structure. He did not order the men to fire. If there was no command, there can be no murder by design. Witnesses contradict each other. Some claim they heard an order, some say they did not, some cannot be sure. The official record preserves these contradictions as if preserving them neutralizes them. Preston is acquitted. This acquittal is not merely a verdict, it is a lesson in how the law metabolizes violence. The official logic is straightforward. Doubt remains. Therefore, guilt cannot be proven beyond doubt. The reality experienced by those who watched men fall is less procedural. It is the feeling of being asked to translate terror into legal grammar, then being told the translation is insufficient. The 8 soldiers are tried next, in late November and early December 1770. The charge is murder. The stakes are larger now, and so is the strategy. The defense must persuade a jury that firing into a crowd was not the act of aggressors, but the reflex of threatened men. The law offers them a familiar pathway, self-defense. The crowd, therefore, must be made dangerous enough to justify lethal fear. This is where Crispus Attucks becomes central, more central than any living witness. He cannot contradict what is said about him. He cannot explain why he was there, what he feared, what he intended, what he saw. His silence is structural, and the defense uses it. In the courtroom, Attucks is reconstructed from hostile description. He is portrayed not as a dead man, but as a force. Witnesses are guided, sometimes gently, sometimes insistently, toward details that reshape the crowd into a mob. The questions circle around bodies. Who held a club? Who pressed forward? Who struck first? The legal issue is not only whether the soldiers fired, but whether they were entitled to fear for their lives. A line appears in testimony and repeats with variations, becoming more confident each time it is retold. A tall mulatto fellow at the front, a stout man with a stick, one who seemed to lead the rest. The official version needs a ringleader, because a ringleader gives chaos a face. Attucks's mixed ancestry, African and indigenous, makes him especially convenient for this role. The law does not say it openly, but the culture around the law does. Certain bodies are easier to fear, easier to blame, easier to imagine as violent. The prosecution, for its part, seeks to keep the focus on the shots. A line of soldiers, muskets raised, men unarmed or lightly armed, gunfire into flesh. They point to the dead as evidence that the response was disproportionate. They emphasize that soldiers are trained to withstand provocation and that the state's monopoly on force carries responsibility. The official version they offer is the town's. The soldiers used imperial power to punish civilians. Both sides speak in the language of order. Both sides treat the crowd as a single entity when it suits them, and neither side is equipped to tell the full truth of what the victims experienced, because the lived reality of the crowd is not the same as the courtroom's portrait. The crowd on March 5th was not a coherent army. It was a layered, frightened, angry mixture of people who had been living under a tightening system. Some threw snow, some shouted, some watched, some stood at the edge of violence without controlling it. Fear moved through the group unevenly. No transcript can capture the way the street felt when muskets appeared, how the body recognizes danger before the mind can narrate it. For Attucks, this gap is the deepest. If he advanced, what did advance mean in a crowded street? If he held a club, was it a weapon or a tool picked up in panic? If he was in front, was he leading or being pressed forward? The courtroom demands clean answers. The night did not provide them. The defense makes its most consequential move by shifting moral attention away from the soldiers and onto the dead. Attucks is described as the kind of man who would provoke violence, as though his character could retroactively authorize his killing. The implication is subtle but consistent. If he was dangerous, then the soldiers' fear was reasonable. If their fear was reasonable, then the shots were legally excusable. Here, the official version reveals its cruelty. It does not need to prove that Attucks deserved to die. It only needs to make him frightening enough that his death becomes an acceptable consequence of restoring order. The prosecution tries to resist this, but the structure of the courtroom favors the defense. The dead cannot be cross-examined into humanity. Attucks's history as a runaway, if it is raised, becomes a stain, not an explanation. The fact that he lived outside the law's protection becomes, perversely, a reason the law can use him without restraint. His life is treated as suspect. His death is treated as evidence. The jury listens. They watch witnesses struggle to recall details months later. They hear different men describe the same seconds in incompatible ways. They see that the archive is not a window into truth, but a battlefield of competing certainties. In such conditions, the law does what it often does. It retreats to the safety of doubt. The verdict is mixed. Most soldiers are acquitted. 2 are convicted of manslaughter rather than murder, a narrower admission that shots were unlawful but not malicious in the legal sense. The law offers a mechanism for mercy, a reduced charge, a ritual punishment, a closing of the file. The 2 convicted are branded on the thumb, a small mark meant to stand in for 5 dead bodies. The courtroom calls this balance. Outside the courthouse, the reality is not balanced. 5 men remain dead. Their families remain without them. Boston remains occupied by an empire that has demonstrated its willingness to fire into crowds. And the message absorbed by many working people, especially those already vulnerable, is not that justice was done, but that justice has limits, and that those limits often align with power. For Crispus Attucks, the outcome is particularly stark. In the defense's official version, he becomes the dangerous frontman whose alleged aggression helps absolve those who shot him. In the town's official version, he becomes one of the people, simplified into a martyr for liberty. In the reality experienced by his body on March 5th, he is neither legal concept nor symbol. He is a man who entered a crowded street at night in a city that did not fully recognize his rights, and he died under the force of the state. The archive closes one kind of question, guilt in the narrow legal sense, while leaving larger questions open. Who is allowed to threaten, and who is punished for being perceived as threatening? Whose fear is taken seriously by law? Whose death becomes a tool in someone else's argument? In the winter light of December 1770, Boston's courtroom empties, ink dries, signatures settle into permanence. The official record is complete enough to be cited, repeated, weaponized. The dead remain silent, and the system that made their silence useful returns to its steady work, uninterrupted, patient, and ready to call itself justice again when necessary. Part E8. Martyrdom. Rewritten. Newspapers, memory, and erasure. After the trial, Boston speaks as though a wound has been stitched shut. The court has issued verdicts. The soldiers have been processed through the machinery of law. The city's leaders can now point to procedure and claim restraint. On paper, the crisis has been contained. But the street does not forget on command. Memory keeps moving, even when the file is closed. The verdicts create a new kind of tension, not the tension of imminent violence, but the slow, bitter tension of interpretation. People begin to argue not only about what happened on March 5th, but about what it is allowed to mean. The official version that emerges from the courtroom is careful and narrow. It emphasizes uncertainty, provocation, self-defense. It reduces the night to a dispute over seconds, as though history can be decided by the position of a musket at a particular moment. This version does not need to deny death, it only needs to deny deliberate wrongdoing. It preserves the legitimacy of the empire's authority by insisting that authority acted under threat. Alongside it grows another official version, produced by Boston's patriot leadership and sympathetic printers. Here, the massacre is framed as evidence of tyranny, soldiers firing into civilians, imperial power punishing dissent. The victims are described as innocent townspeople, representatives of a violated community. In this telling, the dead are not only mourned, they are deployed. Their bodies become a moral charge laid against the crown. These two versions compete, but they share a structural feature. Both are willing to simplify, both turn complex lives into symbols. Both need the dead to carry a message larger than themselves. Crispus Attucks is the most unstable element in this transformation. His death is indispensable to the story. He is often identified as the first killed, yet his life resists the clean arc of patriotic myth. He was not merely a Bostonian, in the legal sense the revolutionaries preferred. He was a man of African and indigenous descent, likely born enslaved, living in a city where the law treated his movement as suspicious. To center him fully would force Boston to confront its own contradictions too early, too directly. So the early commemorations handle him with caution. His name appears, but it is often surrounded by language that absorbs him into an undifferentiated people. In some accounts, his racial identity is muted or omitted. In others, it is mentioned only when it can serve a point, either to demonstrate that imperial bullets do not discriminate or to imply, as the defense did, that he was inherently threatening. This is where the archive becomes a second battlefield. Newspapers do not simply report, they select, repeat, and shape. A single detail, Attucks's height, his occupation, his ancestry, can be emphasized or quietly dropped. Over time, repetition becomes authority. The more a version is printed, the more it feels like fact, even when it began as strategy. In pamphlets and essays, the massacre is linked to broader grievances: taxation without representation, standing armies, abuse of power. The dead become evidence of a pattern. Their individual lives fade into the background as the political argument advances. This is not always malicious. It is the logic of mobilization. Political movements require clarity, and clarity often requires sacrifice, of nuance, of complexity, of inconvenient truth. The reality experienced by those closest to the victims is different. Grief is not abstract. It is the shock of absence at a table, the sudden poverty created by a lost wage, the fear of walking past soldiers after dark. For communities on the margins, Black Bostonians, indigenous laborers, sailors without stable ties, grief is compounded by the knowledge that public sympathy is conditional. Mourning is permitted, but dignity must be negotiated. As anniversaries of March 5th begin to be observed, they take on a ritual quality. Orations are delivered. The event is retold with solemn emphasis. The massacre becomes a civic lesson. It is presented as a warning. Tyranny will kill. Liberty must resist. These orations create a public memory that is disciplined, coherent, and politically useful. Yet within this disciplined memory, Attucks's position remains unsettled. He appears as a martyr, but not always as a man. He is invoked, but rarely examined. His life, his enslavement, his flight, his years of precarious freedom is not easily integrated into speeches meant to inspire unity. To speak honestly about his life would require speaking honestly about bondage in Massachusetts and about the limited radius of colonial liberty. So the story is edited, not through a single act of censorship, but through a pattern of emphasis. The archive keeps what is comfortable. It avoids what is destabilizing. This is how erasure operates most effectively, not by denying existence, but by narrowing it. The defense's courtroom portrayal of Attucks does not disappear either. It lingers like a stain. In some retellings, especially those sympathetic to imperial authority, he is remembered as the dangerous instigator whose aggression forced the soldiers' hands. Even when this version is not stated explicitly, it influences how some audiences interpret his inclusion as martyr. The question is always present beneath the surface. Was he a victim, or was he to blame? This question is not asked equally of all the dead. It is asked of Attucks because his body carries racial meanings that the society has been trained to fear. The same crowd action described as spirited resistance, when performed by white apprentices, can be described as savage violence when associated with a black man. The archive mirrors this bias. It codifies it. It gives it a durable form. As the 1770s progress, revolutionary urgency intensifies. Boston's crisis becomes part of a larger colonial rupture. The massacre is folded into a chain of events leading toward war. In the forward momentum of revolution, older complexities are flattened. The dead are absorbed into a narrative of collective suffering under imperial rule. The question of who suffered under local rule is postponed. Attucks becomes a figure invoked when useful and neglected when inconvenient. His name survives, but it does not always carry his full story. He is simultaneously celebrated and stripped. The revolution needs martyrs, but it is not yet prepared to admit that one of its earliest martyrs embodied the very unfreedom it refuses to confront. The psychological tension deepens. The same society that can mourn a dead black man as evidence of British cruelty can continue to tolerate black bondage in everyday life. The same newspapers that print speeches about natural rights can print runaway notices. The same leaders who condemn standing armies can own enslaved people or benefit from the commerce that slavery makes possible. The archive holds these contradictions side by side without reconciling them. In public memory, March 5th becomes an open wound that is also a tool. It is displayed, cited, repeated, taught. But as it is used, it is also sanitized. It becomes safer, it becomes more symbolic and less bodily. The snow, the fear, the smoke, the collapse. These details recede behind the calm authority of printed prose. For Crispus Attucks, this rewriting is both a form of survival and a second death. His name remains present in history, but his life remains largely absent. He becomes the first to fall, yet not fully allowed to stand. The file is not closed, despite the verdicts. It is merely relocated, from courtrooms to newspapers, from depositions to commemorations, from the messy truth of a winter night to the controlled rhythm of public memory. And in that controlled rhythm, the hardest facts are often the ones most quietly removed. That Attucks lived as a man pursued by law, died under state gunfire, and was remembered by a revolution that still could not decide whether his freedom mattered when he was alive. Part 9. Freedom claimed, freedom denied, the afterlife of the Boston Massacre. The years after 1770 do not deliver resolution. They deliver escalation. Boston's grievances widen into rebellion, rebellion into war, war into a new political order. The language of liberty spreads across the colonies like fire through dry timber. Bright, fast, consuming. On paper, a nation begins to imagine itself into existence. But for many bodies, liberty remains a word without shelter. The official version of the American Revolution, as it forms in declarations and constitutions, speaks in universal terms. It invokes natural rights, consent of the governed, the illegitimacy of arbitrary power. It names freedom as the central purpose of the new order. The archive of the era is full of confident phrasing and careful signatures, men writing themselves into permanence with ink. Yet the reality experienced by people of African and indigenous descent is not universal. It is conditional and often cruel. Slavery persists in homes and on farms. Black men and women continue to be bought, sold, hired out, punished, pursued. Indigenous communities continue to be displaced and pressured by expanding settler claims. The revolution does not abolish the structures that made Crispus Attucks vulnerable. It merely changes the flag under which they operate. In Massachusetts, the contradiction is particularly sharp because the state wants to see itself as an early birthplace of liberty. Its elites speak as though the North is morally distinct from the plantation South. But the archive refuses that comfort. It contains continued advertisements for runaways. It contains disputes over enslaved labor. It contains the steady normalization of racial hierarchy. The same presses that celebrate freedom continue to print the mechanisms of bondage. Attucks's name persists through this period, but unevenly. He is remembered as a martyr of the Boston Massacre, yet his story is often compressed into a single function: proof that British authority murdered the people. In wartime propaganda, this is useful. Complexity is not. A runaway enslaved man does not fit easily into a narrative that wants to present the colonies as innocent victims seeking rightful autonomy. So the archive continues to simplify him. Meanwhile, Black Bostonians and other people living under racial constraint read the revolution differently. The talk of rights is not merely inspiring, it is dangerous, because it raises expectations the law is not prepared to meet. Some pursue freedom through petitions and lawsuits. Some seek it through military service, bargaining labor and risk for promises of emancipation. Some are forced into service without consent, their bodies drafted by whichever side can seize them. The war creates movement and opportunity, but also new forms of capture. British forces sometimes offer freedom to enslaved people who escape rebel owners, using emancipation as strategy. Patriot leaders condemn this as theft and manipulation, revealing the limits of their liberty rhetoric. The official version insists the British are corrupting property relations. The lived reality is that enslaved people seize any crack in the system that might lead to survival. In this environment, Attucks becomes a contested ancestor. For white patriots, he is a symbol of colonial innocence, harmed by imperial violence. For black communities, he is something more complex, a man whose death exposes the hypocrisy of a freedom movement that did not fully include him. His martyrdom is both evidence and indictment. As the new nation consolidates, commemorations of March 5th continue. Orators stand before audiences and retell the night of gunfire as a foundational trauma. The event becomes a civic ritual, a way to rehearse moral identity. The dead are invoked to teach lessons about vigilance against tyranny, but the content of these commemorations shifts with political need. In some years, Attucks is foregrounded to emphasize unity across classes and origins. In other years, his name fades, replaced by safer figures. The archive reveals this pattern not through explicit confession, but through omission. What is not said, whose details are not repeated, whose life is reduced to a footnote. The reality of racial inequality continues regardless of how the story is told. Black people in Massachusetts live under social suspicion and economic constraint. They face barriers to employment, property, education, and public standing. Even as gradual emancipation begins to take hold in the state's legal culture, freedom is not accompanied by security. A free black man can still be treated as a threat. A free black woman can still be treated as disposable. The law may loosen ownership while maintaining control. In the early 19th century, as the United States expands and slavery deepens in the South, Attucks's name becomes newly valuable to abolitionists. They search for foundational symbols that expose the nation's moral fracture. Attucks offers a painful clarity. The first martyr for American liberty was a man the law had once treated as property. To speak his name is to drag the contradiction into the open. Black activists and abolitionist writers reclaim him more deliberately now. They emphasize his identity rather than smoothing it away. They present him as proof that black people were present at the nation's origin, not as passive recipients of freedom, but as victims of the same violence that patriots condemn. They use him to argue that citizenship and dignity cannot be restricted by race without betraying the revolution's own claims. This reclamation is not merely symbolic, it is strategic. In speeches and pamphlets, Attucks becomes an early witness against the nation's selective memory. His death is cited to demand inclusion in the present. The archive, once used to dilute him, is turned into an indictment. Yet even this reclamation has limits. It must work within a society that still fears black assertion. The same culture that can tolerate Attucks as a dead martyr often resists black men and women as living claimants. The nation becomes comfortable honoring black sacrifice in the past while denying black equality in the present. Martyrdom is acceptable. Autonomy is threatening. This is the moral tension at the core of Attucks's afterlife. His death becomes a bridge between competing narratives, but the bridge is unstable. White Americans can point to him and say, "We have always stood for freedom," while ignoring the structures that made his life precarious. Black Americans can point to him and say, "We have always been here," while still being treated as outsiders in the legal and social order. In this way, Attucks is preserved and erased at the same time. Preserved as a name attached to a date, March 5th, 1770. Erased as a full person whose existence reveals what Boston and the nation preferred not to see. That liberty, as practiced, was often a privilege granted by power rather than a right recognized in humanity. The archive continues to grow. It collects anniversaries, speeches, school lessons, civic plaques. Each layer of memory adds distance from the street where he fell. The snow becomes metaphor, the muskets become symbol, the bodies become moral shorthand. But beneath the metaphor remains the body's truth. A man who lived under the shadow of capture, who stood in a crowd shaped by class and coercion, who died when state power chose force over restraint. The nation that inherited his story continues to debate what his death means while avoiding what his life demands. Freedom is claimed loudly in documents. It is denied quietly in practice. And Crispus Attucks, suspended between those realities, remains a test the country repeats without always recognizing it is being tested. Part 10. An Unsettled Ledger. What America Chose to Remember. By the time the new nation begins to speak with confidence, the Boston Massacre has already been converted into a foundational parable. It is taught as an origin point, a moment when the abuse of power became visible enough to justify rupture. The story is repeated in speeches, school books, commemorations, trimmed into a form that can be carried easily. In this official memory, March 5, 1770, becomes a clear lesson. Tyranny fires, liberty bleeds, the people awaken. But archives do not merely preserve, they select. The case file that remains, testimonies, verdicts, published accounts, later memorials, offers a nation a choice about what to emphasize. It can keep the event as a warning against imperial authority, or it can look closer and confront what the event also reveals about local authority. It can treat Crispus Attucks as a generic victim of British violence, or it can admit what his life indicates, that Boston's liberty was never evenly distributed, and that the law that condemned empire also protected bondage. The official version America prefers is stable. It is legible. It frames the colonies as civilians harmed by an occupying force. It celebrates restraint and legal process as proof of moral superiority. It keeps the narrative within manageable boundaries, British soldiers as the problem, American patriots as the solution. In this story, the massacre is a chapter on the road to independence, and independence resolves the moral conflict. Yet the reality experienced by bodies like Attucks's does not resolve at independence. It continues. To say Crispus Attucks became a martyr is true, but it is incomplete. Martyrdom is a form of ownership. Once a man is dead, others can claim him. They can decide what his death stands for. They can smooth away the inconvenient parts of his life until he fits the shape of their argument. The archive shows this process in slow motion. First, the courtroom, where he is cast as a threat. Then the patriotic memory, where he is absorbed into the people. Then later reclaims, where his blackness and indigenous ancestry are emphasized to expose hypocrisy. Each stage is not simply remembrance, it is negotiation over meaning. The nation's earliest public memory of Attucks is cautious. It tends to include his name without lingering on his condition. His status as a runaway enslaved man is not given the same ceremonial weight as his death. In many retellings, he is honored as a fallen patriot without being acknowledged as someone denied the legal protections patriots claim to defend. The archive prefers the clean arc. Oppressed colony resists oppressor. It avoids the messier arc. Oppressed people existed inside the colony's own structures, and their oppression did not end when British troops left. This is not accidental, it is functional. A nation newly born cannot easily admit that its founding story contains unfreedom at the center. It needs unity, it needs heroes, it needs martyrdom to be simple. Complexity threatens cohesion, so the early republic learns to remember Attucks in a way that does not demand too much from the living. But the ledger remains unsettled because the facts remain stubborn. Crispus Attucks was not merely a citizen injured by foreign soldiers. He was a man whose life was shaped by the local law of property and human beings. He lived under the shadow of capture and return. He moved through Boston's port as someone whose mobility was always suspect. When he died not as a protected member of the polity, but as a vulnerable body in a crowd. One more life the state could afford to treat as expendable. The official file does not say this in one sentence. It does not need to. It reveals it through structure, through who speaks and who cannot, through which witnesses are considered credible, through how quickly Attucks's character becomes a legal tool. In the soldier's trial, the defense learns that to weaken the moral force of the massacre, it is useful to make Attucks frightening. It is useful to place him at the front of the crowd. It is useful to imply that his body itself constituted threat. Here, the archive exposes the psychological architecture of power. Fear is not distributed evenly, it is assigned. A soldier's fear is treated as reasonable, therefore exculpatory. A black man's alleged aggression is treated as inherent, therefore condemnatory, even when he is the one dead on the ground. The law does not have to declare racial hierarchy to enact it. It only has to decide whose fear counts. In the patriotic retellings that follow, the hierarchy is managed differently, but not erased. Attucks is included as a martyr, but his specific vulnerability is often left unspoken. He becomes proof that the empire's bullets were unjust, but not proof that the colony's bondage was unjust. His death is made safe for national memory by being detached from the system that shaped his life. And yet, the detachment never fully holds. Each time Attucks's name is spoken, the contradiction presses against the story's edges. A man pursued by the law becomes a symbol of lawful liberty. A body once described in a runaway notice becomes a body honored in civic speech. The gap between those two forms of paper is where the nation's discomfort lives. In later generations, black communities and abolitionists refuse the safe version. They insist on the full file. They insist that Attucks's death is not merely an anti-imperial story, but an American story, one that indicts the selective application of rights. They reclaim him not as a decoration in a national myth, but as a witness against it. They argue, in effect, that the nation cannot honor his death while ignoring what his life reveals. This reclaiming changes the ledger, but it does not settle it. The United States becomes practiced at honoring black sacrifice without granting black security. It becomes comfortable praising a dead black man as a founding martyr while treating living black citizens as suspicious, disposable, or threatening. Martyrdom is permitted because it cannot demand policy. The living demand policy, and policy threatens power. The archive of Attucks's memory, therefore, is not a single narrative, but a series of revisions that map the country's moral evasions. When America wants unity, it remembers him as one of the people. When it wants to deflect guilt, it remembers him as the dangerous instigator. When it wants to confront injustice, it remembers him as a black and indigenous man whose unfreedom was foundational. Each version is an argument about the present disguised as a statement about the past. What remains constant is the body at the center, a man whose life is mostly absent from paper, whose death is crowded with paper, whose meaning is repeatedly contested by those who survive him. The system that killed him was not a monster. It was ordinary. It was law, procedure, hierarchy, and the slow training of society to accept that some bodies are allowed to be harmed for the sake of order. That is why the horror endures, because it does not require evil as spectacle. It requires only indifference, bureaucracy, and permission, and so the ledger stays open. A nation can commemorate March 5, 1770 with speeches and plaques. It can recite the names of the dead. It can frame the massacre as a warning against tyranny. But the deeper question is quieter and harder. What does it mean to build a story of freedom on a foundation that required unfreedom to function? Crispus Attucks does not answer. The archive does not answer. The file offers only fragments, signatures, and the long echo of musket fire in a winter street. In the end, there is a silence that belongs not to ceremony but to recognition, that the people most useful to history are often those least protected by law, that remembrance can be a form of justice, but also a substitute for it, and that the distance between the official version and the lived reality is where a nation's conscience is measured. The question remains, open on the table, written in ink that never fully dries. If a country can honor a martyr but cannot protect the living who resemble him, what exactly has it learned from his death? 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 Has it learned